Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. Why do bad things happen? That's one of the big unanswerable questions in the world. But that doesn't mean people don't try. There are different ways in which people attempt to answer this question. But for people who try to give a definitive answer, it generally falls into one of two categories. Either it's some mysterious working of God that is beyond our understanding, or it's a punishment for sin. And which category the answer falls into usually depends on their opinion of the person experiencing the suffering. There's a whole branch of theology called theodicy dedicated to this question. In simple terms, theodicy is the attempt to explain how a loving God can allow evil and suffering to exist in the world. Not exactly light stuff, but that's what Jesus is wading into in our text for this morning. Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem, and along the way, he's been teaching and healing and dining with Pharisees. He's stopped to speak to a crowd of listeners. At the end of chapter 12, he has chastised them for not being able to read the signs that he can see so clearly about what's looming. He warns them about using their own judgment to interpret how God is calling them to act, rather than relying on others who might put a worse spin on things. The people listening to Jesus are starting to get the idea that something's going on. There's some sort of emergency, some sort of crisis. They just don't know what to do about it. After all, Jesus is headed to Jerusalem, so something must be brewing. Someone in the crowd confronts Jesus at the beginning of our text today by asking him if he has heard about a group of Galileans who were killed by Pilate's troops as they were offering their sacrifices in the temple. Many Jews in Jerusalem, located in the historical southern kingdom of Judah, had little respect for the Jews in Galilee. Galilee was far to the north, separated from Jerusalem by all of Samaria. So the Jews in Jerusalem who didn't respect the Galilean Jews saw them as second-class citizens. This crime is doubly bad. Not only is it murder, but it's also sacrilege, a defilement of the temple. It is not an event that has come forward through history to be remembered today, but at the time, it was apparently a well-known event. There are four things kind of bubbling underneath the surface of this question. First, there's the question of theodicy. Why did God allow this suffering to happen? Second, there's the question of how they should feel towards Pilate and the Romans. Should they be angry? Or were Pilate and the Romans acting as the tools of God's vengeance? Third, they're placing Jesus in the position of appearing either unpatriotic towards Judea by supporting the crime of Pilate and his soldiers, or subversive towards Rome by opposing this crime. And fourth, they're raising the issue of relations between the Galileans and other Jews. In other words, maybe this wouldn't have happened if it had been some other group of Jews gathered at the temple to make their sacrifices. It's not uncommon to do this kind of mental calculus when a tragedy hits close enough to home for us to feel it, but far enough away for us to be glad it isn't us, isn't our loved ones, our community that's impacted. We try to process how we're feeling and bump up against how we should be feeling, or at least how we think we should be feeling. And if the two don't match, we have to try to reconcile them. It's not uncommon to feel some mixture of fear and guilt and relief, and none of those feel very good in situations like this. Situations like 9/11 or the shooting at the Jewish Community Center in Overland Park a few years ago, or even situations like the hurricane and floods that impacted so much of the southeast U.S. last summer, or the Los Angeles wildfires earlier this year. Tragedies that impact a community or a family close to ours. We might feel, it could have been me, or it should have been me, or thank God it wasn't me, or all three together. And so if we're uncomfortable sitting with our emotions, sometimes the easiest thing to do is play the blame game and think, well, maybe they did something to deserve it. But Jesus knows that there's no good answer to the question of why people suffer and why some people seem to suffer more than others, and he refuses to get caught in that trap. In fact, this particular question is so entangled with the question of vengeance, of the social or ethnic identity of the Galileans, that he removes those questions altogether. He provides his own example of a tower that collapsed in Siloam in a neighborhood in Jerusalem. What about that tragedy? He asks. That was a total accident. Nothing to do with Pilate, nothing to do with Rome, nothing to do with the Galileans. Did that have anything to do with the people who happened to get caught underneath it? He firmly repudiates the idea that the victims of either one of these tragedies were greater sinners than anyone else. In fact, he answers both charges identically, saying in essence, if it were a question of sin, we would be dead already. If that's not enough to set off the alarm bells in people's lives, I don't know what is. So should they make a break for it? Should they throw in the towel? Both are tempting in the midst of a crisis, and it feels like the church is in one now as we struggle to redefine what it means to be a disciple, what it means to follow Jesus in the face of declining membership and attendance, the popularity of the prosperity gospel, and the rise of Christian nationalism, and feelings of apathy, or worse, distrust towards the church from people who are unchurched. Why should we keep trying when there is so much suffering, so much evil, so much hate in the world? The parable of the fig tree that Jesus shares in response to these questions of suffering and evil provides hope, but not answers. The tree in the parable has been in the ground for 3 years and hasn't produced anything. The owner of the vineyard wants to take it out and make room for something else, something that will produce fruit. But the gardener has knowledge that the owner doesn't. The gardener suspects that maybe the soil conditions aren't right, or else it's undernourished. It needs some attention and encouragement. The fig tree itself isn't the problem. Something else is. And that's the end of the parable. We don't know what happens. We don't know whether the tree thrives and bears fruit with the additional aeration of the soil and the extra fertilizer. We don't even know whether the vineyard owner says yes to the extra year. I think that's because we are in the middle of our stories too, and we have to decide for ourselves whether we are going to careen from crisis to crisis until we are worn out with suffering and can't take one more thing. Don't have anything else to give. Until we shrivel up and blow away and the church is no more. Or whether we are going to choose to see the ways in which we are being nourished and strengthened by the grace of God, so that even small actions, even little things we do now can be catalysts for change for the better, can be little gifts of grace for people who need them. I met with my female clergy colleagues for lunch this week. We had a great conversation about chaplaincy. All ELCA seminary students are required to do 1 unit of chaplain training before graduation. We talked about being with families who are suffering, people who are being told their loved ones are dying. And we talked about the universal nature of suffering. No one is immune. No family, no culture, no ethnic group or religion or economic class. Everyone experiences suffering and deserves to be nurtured and tended. Whatever we say about the suffering of someone around the world or across the country, however we respond to that in our minds and hearts, we should respond the same way to the person across the street or across the room. It's incredibly holy work to hold space for people to feel all the ways they feel in those moments. And it can be incredibly hard work too, when the people are young or when accidents happen. There are moments of deep pain and sometimes moments of even deeper joy to be found. Discipleship is not easy. Life is fragile, and suffering is real. We don't know today what tomorrow will bring, but we do know that loving and serving our neighbor returns us grace upon grace. We don't know what causes suffering. We can't answer the question of why, but we can sit in the manure together and know that God is at work, even in the midst of it. Amen.